Well, welcome to Ransom Church. We're so thankful to have you with us this morning. My name is Paul. I get to serve as the campus pastor at West Campus, and today we are diving into week 5 of this series that we've been in called The Rest of the Story. This has been a fun series for a lot of us, and if you've been around, you probably know kind of the approach we've been taking, but I know that's not the case for everybody, so here's what we're doing. We are taking some of the most well-known passages, the most well-known stories from the Bible, and we're trying to dive deeper. Some of these stories are ones, if you grew up in church, you're probably fairly familiar with. Even if you never went to church, never opened a Bible, you might even know some of these. That's how well-known they are. But we're trying to dive deeper and look at the rest of the story. Today, we're going to be diving into a story of these 3 guys named Shadrac, Meshac, and Abednego. Some of you already know those names, and you're thinking back to the story you may have heard back in Sunday school or something like that. Now, truthfully, there's really not a lot in the Bible about these 3 guys, but there is one story in particular that they're pretty well known for, a story that you might have been called the fiery furnace. So, I realize not everybody knows this story, so what I want to do first is kind of give the highlights of it. Give you the quick snapshot of their story, and then we'll dive deeper. So, let's catch everybody up to speed. There's these 3 guys, Shadrac, Meshac, and Abednego, and they are part of the people of God. They're Hebrew men, and in this story, they're in this enemy territory called Babylon. You might have heard of Babylon. Last week, Pastor Phil told us about Daniel and the lion's den, and if you weren't aware, these 3 guys and Daniel were actually close friends. They were peers. They were contemporaries. Their story is recorded in the book of Daniel. So all of these 4 guys are living in Babylon under the reign of King Nebuchadnezzar. King Nebuchadnezzar is a pretty big deal in history. He expanded Babylon enormously. He was kind of this famous, well-known king, so much so that at one point during his rule, he decided he would build an enormous statue of himself. We're told it's 90 feet tall, and it's plated with gold. So if you build a 90-foot-tall gold statue of yourself, you're probably going to put out a decree that everybody in the kingdom has to bow to this statue, right? I mean, that seems logical. So King Nebuchadnezzar puts out this decree, makes this law that everybody has to bow to this statue and worship him. And that's where Shadrach, Meshac, and Abednego make a stand. They decide they're not going to bow to this statue. They're not going to compromise the core of their faith. Unfortunately for them, they have some jealous co-workers who tattle on them. They tell King Nebuchadnezzar that these 3 aren't bowing to his statue. Needless to say, this really upsets Nebuchadnezzar. So he vows that he will follow through on a threat that he had made to kill anyone who disobeyed by throwing them into a blazing furnace. He brings them up. These 3 guys that disobeyed. He gives them one more chance to bow, to change their mind, but they refuse. They won't do it. So in a rage, he cranks the furnace up as hot as it can possibly go and throws them into the fire to die. That's where we're going to pick it up in Daniel chapter 3. It says, "But suddenly Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in amazement and exclaimed to his advisors, 'Didn't we tie up 3 men and throw them into the furnace?' 'Yes, your majesty, we certainly did,' they replied. 'Look,' Nebuchadnezzar shouted, 'I see 4 men, unbound, walking around in the fire unharmed, and the 4th looks like a god.' Then Nebuchadnezzar came as close as he could to the door of the flaming furnace and shouted, 'Shadrach, Meshac, Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here.' So they stepped out of the fire. Then the high officers, officials, governors, and advisors crowded around them and saw that the fire had not touched them. Not a hair on their heads was singed, and their clothing was not scorched. They didn't even smell of smoke." Shadrach, Meshac, and Abednego survived the fiery furnace. Now, whether that's the very first time you ever heard that story, or if you're thinking back to like 50 years ago when you first heard it, you gotta admit that is pretty darn exciting. I mean, it is an amazing story. It's theatrical, it's suspenseful, it's fairly mysterious. It is a fantastic, amazing story. Last week, Pastor Phil told us a story that's fairly similar in some ways. Daniel, again, who's friends with these guys, refused to quit praying to his God, and as punishment, he was thrown into a den of lions. But God also miraculously stepped in and rescued him. And now it feels like we have this pattern from the book of Daniel. These amazing people of faith, they show a pattern of standing up to culture, standing up to this evil ruler, and God keeps saving them in miraculous ways. We love that, don't we? Those are stories that we love. We love the picture of God as a rescuer. We love the picture of God as a rescuer, and for really good reason, right? I mean, if we look around the world today, if we look at our own lives, it is an enormous comfort to know that we have a God who is a rescuer. And I think the account of Shadrach, Meshac, and Abednego is a beautiful reminder of God's rescuing power. But I don't think that's the only point of this story. And remember, today we're looking at the rest of the story. So, I want to paint a broader picture. I want to dive even deeper. And to do so, we need to go back and start at the beginning of the story. I'd love for you to turn with me to the book of Daniel. We're going to be in the first few chapters together, so you can turn to Daniel chapter 1. If you did not bring a Bible or don't own a Bible or forgot a Bible, raise your hand. Our ushers would love to bring you one that you can use today. If you don't own one, keep it. We'd love for you to have it. We're going to be on page 522 of those Bibles, Daniel chapter 1. We actually read this last week, but we're going to review it again to get all on the same page. So let's start in Daniel 1, verse 1. It says, during the 3rd year of King Jehoiakim's reign in Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave him victory over King Jehoiakim of Judah and permitted him to take some of the sacred objects from the temple of God. So Nebuchadnezzar took them back to the land of Babylonia and placed them in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, his chief of staff, to bring to the palace some of the young men of Judah's royal family and other noble families who had been brought to Babylon as captives. So a little explanation of what's going on here. Babylon is this nation. It's this enemy nation to the kingdom of Judah and Israel who besieges and conquers the city of Jerusalem. And Shadrach, Meshac, Abednego, and Daniel are all part of this group of Hebrews who were taken away from their home in Jerusalem and taken to Babylon. You see, in ancient times, these nations, you got to remember, they didn't have planes, they didn't have missiles, so they had to get kind of creative in how they were going to expand and keep their empire. The Babylonians had their own method for this. They would defeat a nation in battle and they would leave, but on their way out, they would be sure to steal any significant religious artifacts. They would steal a batch of the best and brightest citizens because they wanted to make sure that the people who stayed weren't going to get up to any funny business or try to rebel or leave the nation of Babylon. The message was loud and clear. We have your gods, we have your idols, we have your sons and daughters. If you get any ideas, you can imagine what we'll do. And the reason I share all that detail is to show you exactly how these guys ended up in Babylon in the first place. You see, they weren't there on some sort of mission trip. They weren't there on spring break. They weren't there voluntarily at all. They were hostages. They were prisoners of war. And honestly, they were essentially brainwashing candidates. Verse 5 says, the king assigned them a daily ration of food and wine from his own kitchens. They were to be trained for 3 years, and then they would enter the royal service. You see, these guys were shipped off to Babylon to enter a 3-year brainwashing program in preparation for a lifetime of service to this evil king, Nebuchadnezzar. So far, not so good, right? Buckle up, because it's about to get worse. The Bible doesn't say it explicitly, but the odds are extremely high that these young men, on their arrival to Babylon, suffered the humiliation of castration. There's a few things in the text that imply it to be true, and it was an extremely common practice for the circumstances. In addition to that, check out what it says in verse 7. It says, the chief of staff renamed them with these Babylonian names. Daniel was called Belteshazzar. Hananiah was called Shadrach. Mishael was called Meshac. Azariah was called Abednego. See, if you heard this story growing up, the names that you probably know them by aren't even their original names. And remember, names are a huge deal in this culture. Their original Hebrew names were praises to the God Most High. And those names were taken away from them and replaced with names of submission to the Babylonian gods. Every time you and I use the names Shadrach, Meshac, and Abednego, it's a painful reminder of just what had happened to them. Let's keep going. Verse 4 says they were to be trained in the language and literature of Babylon. Sounds pretty harmless, right? Just learning the language and the literature. Well, unfortunately, the primary literature was all centered around witchcraft, their pagan witchcraft religion. Learning the language was centered around their occultic practices. Basically, they're forced to go to school, and the only school in town is the Babylonian school of witchcraft and wizardry, which is, insult to injury, because obviously we know that Hogwarts is the best school of witchcraft and wizardry. A little Harry Potter joke for you guys out there. Nerds get it. Okay. Now, there's probably even more to their story that we don't even know about, but let's summarize what we have so far. These guys, they're kidnapped from their homeland, they're stripped of their manhood, they're subjected to occultic education and pagan indoctrination, they're even removed of their given name, which is replaced by a name praising a false god. Pretty terrible set of circumstances, don't you think? Pretty awful story, which actually makes me ask a question. Did Shadrach, Meshac, and Abednego really expect to walk out of that furnace? When they're about to get thrown into this fiery furnace in the story we started with, do you think Shadrach, Meshac, and Abednego really thought they would survive? Based on their whole story and circumstances, it's hard to imagine what they were thinking. My wife, Allie, and I have a little boy. He is 9 months old now. He's amazing. We love him so much. And as we have been settling in as parents, we've kind of been asking ourselves a lot of those questions that first-time parents probably all do about parenthood. And for us, it started early on because Axel's adopted. It started on with questions like, what if something changes in the situation? What if his biological family chooses to parent or something happens on our end? He gets taken from our home. What would that do to us? How would I handle that? What if he gets really, really sick and there's nothing that I can do about it? How would that shake me? What would I do? What if he grows up and comes to me one day holding a purple shirt saying, I want to be a Vikings fan? Like, what kind of, Or even worse, if he has a puke green shirt and wants to be a Packers fan. I mean, there's so many bad options. What if he develops a substance addiction? What if he ends up in prison? What if he wanders far from God and I have no idea where he stands with Jesus? Listen, the truth is, God has been really, really good to me in my life. I have been so blessed. God has been so generous to me, and those questions are still so scary to think about. God's given me no reason to doubt him, to not trust him, but it's so easy to lose hope and to let doubt creep in. And I know if I was in Shadrach, Meshac, or Abednego's shoes, I would probably look back at my story and I would lose hope. And maybe that's exactly where you are today, too. Maybe your story is a lot like theirs. And from the outside, it looks like time after time after time where God could have rescued them, could have delivered them, could have removed them from hard things or protected them from this pain, and yet he didn't. From the outside, their story looks like a series of letdowns where God failed to show up, where he failed to rescue them. God had allowed them to be castrated and subjugated by an enemy king that built statues of himself and forced everybody to worship him. Why in the world would they believe God would rescue them? What would make them think God was still with them? I believe that their faith was not about themselves, it was about God. I don't think their faith, their relationship with God was built on themselves, it was built on God. Their faith was not about what God had done for them or not done for them, but it was based on who God is and who he was. Their faith was not as much about their own story as much as about his story. Listen, today, maybe your story is really, really hard. And if that's the case, I want you to know that my heart breaks for that. And as a church, we love you and care about you, and we're so glad you're here. But I also want to make sure you don't miss something crucial. Because if you're waiting around for your story to be good enough for God to earn your respect, I think you're missing the point. If you're waiting for your story to be good enough to draw near to God, I don't think you're understanding who God is. Because you see, God's story is what matters the most. From the creation of the world to the love for his people, even in their rejection and rebellion from him, his story peaking in the life and death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, that story is worth giving your life to. Your story might be amazing. You might feel like you don't even need God. Your story might be awful right now. It might be completely boring or somewhere in between. Your story matters so much, but you need to understand that his story is the fuller context, and your story fits into that. You see, Shadrach, Meshac, and Abednego's story had beautiful parts, and it had some really, really, really hard parts. And in the thick of that story, with time after time of failure and letdown, they're faced with a choice to compromise the core of their faith, to give up on God. And they chose not to bow. Look again at verse 13. After they'd refused to bow, it says, "Then Nebuchadnezzar flew into a rage and ordered that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought before him. When they were brought in, Nebuchadnezzar said to them, 'Is it true that you refuse to serve my gods or to worship the gold statue I've set up? I'll give you one more chance to bow down and worship the statue I've made when you hear the sound of the musical instruments. But if you refuse, you will be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace. And then what God will be able to rescue you from my power?'" Listen, put yourself in their shoes for a minute. Think back to the totality of their story, all the hard things that they had faced, all the ways they'd seen pain and difficulty, and probably felt like God was silent or maybe absent altogether. Think about all the information, all the experience that would tell them to just lose hope, to just give up, to just compromise, save yourself, and listen to how they respond. "Oh, Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. If we're thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you've set up. Even if he doesn't." They said, our God has the power to save us. We even think that he will, but even if he doesn't, he's still good. Even if he doesn't, he's still worth it. Even if he doesn't, we will be faithful. Even if he doesn't. I've been in church my entire life. I've heard this story so many times. I've heard it preached on and talked about. And so often the message that gets sent, intentionally or not, is that if you stand firm, God will save you. Right? These men had the courage to stand against culture, to defy peer pressure, to stand up against evil, and God vindicated them. And the message that gets translated is that if we stand up for our faith, God will rescue us from the fiery furnace we may face. If we just believe strong enough, he will save us from harm. And I got to admit, as a pastor, it is so tempting to stand up here and tell you exactly that. To inspire you to be brave, to be bold for Jesus by using this story to show that God rescues us from the fiery furnace. Because the truth is, he can and he does. Hebrews 11 is this amazing chapter in the Bible that tells story after story of these people who followed God and God's power worked in and through them. And it reaches this apex in verse 33 saying, "By faith, these people overthrew kingdoms, ruled with justice, received what God had promised them. They shut the mouths of lions, quenched the flames of fire, and escaped death by the edge of the sword. Their weakness was turned to strength. They became strong in battle and put whole armies to flight. Women even received their loved ones back again from death. God does those things. He's done them, he's still doing them, and he still will do them. God fights for us. He's making ends meet. He's protecting houses. He's providing jobs. We need to see these things. We need to celebrate them and give God the glory for them. God is still pulling people out of the fiery furnace today. But that might not be your story right now. And that's not where Hebrews 11 ends. It says, but others were tortured, refusing to turn from God in order to be set free. They placed their hope in a better life after the resurrection. Some were jeered at, and their backs were cut open with whips. Others were chained in prison. Some died by stoning. Some were sawed in half, and others were killed with the sword. Some went about wearing skins of sheep and goats, destitute and oppressed and mistreated. They were too good for this world, wandering over deserts and mountains, hiding in caves and holes in the ground. Even if he doesn't. I so desperately wish that I could tell you to just be brave and God will rescue you from any consequences you might face, that he'll save you, pull you out of any painful situations that you're in right now. But in Acts chapter 7, this amazing guy named Stephen stood up for his faith, preached a powerful sermon, and was stoned to death because of it. The Apostle Paul, who wrote most of the New Testament, was in prison over and over and over and was eventually executed by the Romans. And if you look around in the world today, you can pick out numerous examples of places where it feels like the fire is consuming the faithful. Pastor Larry Osborne wrote a book called Thriving in Babylon. We even looked at it a little bit last week. And he says this, when it comes to fiery furnaces and hungry lions, Daniel and his friends aren't examples, they're exceptions. No matter how godly we become, our odds of surviving the martyr's fire or the lion's appetites are rather bleak. As far as I know, Daniel and his friends are the only ones who ever walked out unscathed. Everyone else perished, dying a horrible and agonizing death, even if he doesn't. Honestly, I don't know if Shadrac, Meshac, and Abednego truly believed that they would walk out of that furnace. When they're about to get thrown into it, if I was in their shoes, I'd be skeptical. God had allowed them to be captured, tortured, subjected to so much evil. Maybe they assumed that they would die a horrible death. Pastor Osborne goes on to say, Jesus and his followers would face injustice and persecution. He experienced them himself. The same goes for all the apostles. In fact, fiery trials were considered to be such a normal part of the Christian experience that the apostle Peter wrote that we shouldn't be surprised when they come our way. They're neither strange nor unusual. Just a few weeks ago, we recognized Good Friday, the Friday before Easter, where we remember that Jesus, the sinless Son of God, was tortured and beaten and mocked and humiliated and murdered, even if he doesn't. You see, if my faith is based on things around me, things in my life that can be taken away at a moment's notice, or things in my life that I just have no control over, then I am always going to be on a knife's edge, one phone call away from being completely lost and hopeless. If your relationship with God is only about what he's done for you, or about what you expect him to do for you, or what you think you deserve, then the next painful, unexpected thing in your life will bring your faith crashing down around you, even if he doesn't. Listen, I'm not trying to paint some sort of bleak picture that your situation is hopeless or that we're all destined for some torturous end. Remember, we serve a God who loves us, and we can see countless examples of him rescuing his people even now. A truly strong faith actually says, my God is so strong that he can end this pain. My God is so good that he can save me from this dire situation. He can provide where it seems impossible. He can fix this problem that seems unfixable. A strong faith says he can do all those things, and I believe he will, because he very well might do it. But an even stronger, an even deeper kind of faith says, but even if he doesn't, I believe he can do these things, and I think he will, but even if he doesn't, I still trust him. Even if he doesn't, he's still good. Even if he doesn't, I still love him, and he still loves me. The story of Shadrach, Meshac, and Abednego shows us we have a God who rescues, and we need to celebrate that. But the rest of the story shows us two things even more important than that. First, it shows us God is always with us. Verse 25, look, Nebuchadnezzar shouted, I see 4 men unbound, walking around in the fire unharmed, and the 4th looks like a god. Now, people have always speculated on who this 4th person in the fire was. Ever since it was first told, people were giving guesses. Maybe it was an angel, right? Maybe it was some sort of guardian angel situation. Or maybe the angel Gabriel or Michael. Maybe it was Elijah or some former prophet. Some have even wondered if it was Jesus himself. If you want my professional opinion, I like to envision Jesus, walking out of the fire wearing Ray-Bans and holding a popsicle that's somehow not melting. That's a picture into my brain. So this is just an artist rendition. I don't think that's an actual photo from the time. That's what I like to imagine. Personally, I don't think we know who was in the fire with him, and I'm not sure that it matters. When you are in those fires in your life, what matters is that you aren't alone. That God is with you, that he's always with you. And believe me, I understand that sometimes it doesn't feel like it. Sometimes it feels like you can't see him, like you can't hear him. And I actually believe that's why we so desperately need each other. We need to help each other see where God still is, to speak truth and love and encouragement, to truly embody the reality that God is with us. Around here, groups, teams, discipleship, all sorts of beautiful ways to let people look into our life, even when we're in the fire, especially when we're in the fire, and say, look, I see someone else, and it sure looks like God. Because God is truly always with us. The second thing that we're reminded is that we know the end of the story. Shadrach, Meshac, and Abednego had the faith to say, even if he doesn't, because they knew that God's plan was bigger than that moment. They knew that God's timeline, God's victory was eternal. It was bigger than them, and we can trust that it's better than we could ever imagine. Listen to what the Apostle Peter, one of Jesus' closest friends, said, so be truly glad. There is wonderful joy ahead, even though you must endure many trials for a little while. These trials will show that your faith is genuine. It's being tested as fire tests and purifies gold, though your faith is far more precious than mere gold. So when your faith remains strong through many trials, it will bring you much praise and glory and honor on the day when Jesus Christ is revealed to the whole world. You see, the end of the story is that Jesus has already won. In his life and death and resurrection, Jesus defeated sin and death. When we worship free and live free and serve free, we are experiencing that victory of Jesus right here and right now. And the end of the story is that Jesus is coming back. He's going to come back and set things right. He's going to fully and finally usher in the victory that brings a new heaven and a new earth. No matter what you are facing, no matter what thing you're trying to escape, what furnace it feels like you're in, the truth is, even if he doesn't do what you expect or when you expect it, the eternal victory is already secured if your faith is in him. Shadrach, Meshac, and Abednego had a even if he doesn't kind of faith. And they didn't even have the full picture yet. You and I can look at the life of Jesus and say, even if he doesn't, he still died for me. Even if he doesn't, he still set me free. I believe that God can save me. My God is powerful enough, but even if he doesn't, he's coming back and I'll be with him forever. God, we're so thankful that you are a rescuer. That all over our own story and in the world around us, we can see you rescue your people in miraculous ways that can only be explained by your power. But God, I'm also thankful that you're so much bigger and so much better than just that. And I'm thankful that even in the fires that we face in our life, that you are with us and that the victory is already won. God, today some of us feel like we're in the fire right now. And maybe it's because we stood up for our faith, or maybe we feel like we're in a fire that we stepped into on our own volition, or that just the sinful, broken world around us threw us into. And God, we don't know the end of that story. We don't know if you're going to do what we think you're going to do or in the time that we think you're going to do it. But we can trust that you are with us. We can trust that you are good. God, I want to be a person who has an even if he doesn't kind of faith. And God, sometimes I don't even fully believe that. So help my unbelief. God, help us be like Stephen. When Stephen was facing the persecution and the fire in his own life, he looked up to heaven and his eyes were fixed on you. God, help us to be people. Help us to be a church whose eyes are fixed on you regardless of the circumstances around us. Thank you for being a rescuer, and thank you for being with us. In Jesus' name, amen.